known to have unusual talks and unusual speakers, but even by our standards today might be even more special. Today's speaker is Dr. Sridhar, who has an MSc in wildlife biology from the Wildlife Institute of India in Dehradun and a PhD in ecology from Center for Ecological Sciences here in IISc Bangalore. Hari's main research, he has many interests and many research interests, but his main research interest is in trying to understand why birds of different species move together when they are looking for food. So it's not accidental flocks of birds as we do. There are many species of birds which actually consciously, actively associate with members of other species, and as a party of many species together, they go looking for food on their daily life, which is somewhat of a puzzle. And Hari is interested not just in how they might interfere with each other's feeding, how they might affect each other negatively, as most people do, but he's also interested in how they might actually help each other in doing this is his main work. He started this work when he was a master's student. He worked through PhD, and he's published his work, he's published extensively. But I want to say that Hari is a very different kind of student. When we were students, the profile of a student was very different from what it is today. When we were students, we were supposed to be, and very often were, receivers of knowledge, receivers of wisdom. And we were supposed to be trainees, and we were supposed to absorb everything and grow and mature. And at some much later time in our life, we were supposed to begin to impart whatever we have learned to other people. So there was a fairly clear separation between learning and teaching, to put it very crudely, which is very unfortunate because I think these can go hand in hand. Not only should we be students forever, but we can be teachers from the beginning, and I think that's right. I see a very pleasant change in the profile of students today, and I think Hari represents the extreme in this new profile of young people. He collaborates widely. The research that he does with his PhD supervisors is a small fraction of all the things that he does. He collaborates abroad, he teaches, he organizes courses, he writes articles, he even organizes workshops telling people like me how to write a research grant. This is very unusual. It wasn't heard of in our day. It's happening now, and I think Hari is sort of the leading front of this new kind of new profile of students, and I'm very pleased that this is happening, and I'm very happy that Hari is leading this new movement. About a year ago, Hari was invited to the Institute for Advanced Study in Berlin. Those people who go there, typically, they have to propose a project that they will carry out during their stay. On the basis of, that's one of the criteria by which they are actually selected. So, other things, of course, what they have done, their CV, their publication, their referee reports, but also their project, their proposal. It is becoming increasingly fashionable in the Wissenschaftskolleg, this is the Institute for Advanced Study, for people to have, in addition to the project which they have publicly confessed that they will do, to have a secret project, which they do not tell anybody, but reveal at the end. When I was a fellow 15 years ago, I also had a secret project, and but I was one of the few people who had a secret project. Now that trend is growing more and more people have secret projects. And in many cases, it turns out that the secret project is even more interesting than the original project. And I think today we are going to hear about Hari's secret project. Right? I won't say anything more. Go listen.
thanks, Arji, for that very, very generous introduction, and thank you all for coming. So, about a year ago, in September 2013, I had the privilege from September 2013 to March 2014, I had the privilege of being a fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin. It's also known as the Wiko. In English, it's known as the Institute for Advanced Study. And I'm sure many people in this audience are familiar with the Wissenschaftskolleg and know how it functions. But for those who are not, I think I should tell you about this remarkable institute. So what the Wissenschaftskolleg does is that every year it selects and invites scholars from different disciplines, biology, economics, history, writers, musicians, composers, to come and spend a year in Berlin working on a project of their choice. And what's really striking about this institute is the freedom it gives its fellows and the facilities it offers. Fellows are free to come and go as they please. They're free to work when they want to and not work when they don't want to. And the institute offers a wide range of facilities to make their stay as comfortable as possible and as productive as possible. So one good example is the library. Any book you want, any report you want from anywhere in the world is brought to you in less than 2 days. And I've put this to test. Really obscure articles, and every time they've managed to get it. And what's most remarkable about the institute is that at the end of your stay, the institute does not expect you to give them anything back in return. You don't need to produce a report. You don't need to show them the work you've done. It's based completely on faith, and it's just you and your conscience, really, which I think in most cases is a good thing, but it can be exploited, and I maybe show you how. Now, what does the Wissenschaftskolleg get in return? Now, the Wissenschaftskolleg's motivation really is to provide a space, a platform, where there can be dialogue across disciplines. Now, this is not formal interdisciplinary projects, but really a place where scholars from different disciplines can learn about how scholars from other disciplines go about collecting information, carrying out their research, what is the culture of knowledge gathering in each of these disciplines, and so on. And through this process, the Wissenschaftskolleg hopes that maybe scholars might be able to sort of rethink their own way of collecting information, their own way of doing research, maybe try and learn from other disciplines. And this really is the motivation of the Wissenschaftskolleg. And to achieve this motivation, the Wissenschaftskolleg has three very, very modest expectations of its fellows. So the fellows during the stay are expected to give one talk describing the work they have done and the work they propose to do during their fellowship. And this is really for the other fellows to learn about what each fellow is doing. The fellows are expected to attend and participate in the discussions around other fellows' talks. And to my mind, most importantly, the fellows are expected to eat with the other fellows every day at the Wissenschaftskolleg restaurant. So every day, on 3 days of the week during lunch, on 1 day of the week during dinner, all the fellows get together in the restaurant and have their meals together. And what the Wissenschaftskolleg hopes is that during these times, during the meal times, the fellows will interact with each other and get to know each other really well. And the meal time is really important because that really is the only time when fellows get together. The rest of the time they're on their own, working on their independent projects. So it's this period of time, really, 1.5 to 2 hours, when the fellows really get to interact with each other. And the Wissenschaftskolleg hopes that the fellows from one discipline speak to the fellows from other discipline, and so on. But now, the question is, what do the fellows themselves want? It's fine for the Wissenschaftskolleg to hope that by creating this space, that there'll be talk across disciplines, there'll be this exchange of knowledge across disciplines. But how do the fellows decide where to sit? This is a picture of the restaurant in the Wissenschaftskolleg, and this is a situation that confronted me every day when I went to the restaurant for a meal. So I walk into the restaurant, pick up my tray, load my tray with food, and then I would turn around, and then there would be all these choices. Here's one table with 3 other biologists. Should I go there? No. This is something I know. These are people I'm comfortable with. This is a topic I'm familiar with. Should I go to this table? At the other table is an economist and a historian. Should I go there? This is an opportunity to gain new knowledge, new ways of thinking maybe. So this is a situation that me and other fellows are confronted with every day in the restaurant, right? And when I thought about this, I also thought that this is a situation that also confronts these birds in these mixed species flocks. So like Arji was saying, for my PhD, I studied mixed species flocks of birds. And that's an illustration of a mixed species flock from a rainforest in the Western Ghats. Mixed species flock is a social group, a social foraging group of birds of different species. In this group, there are 11 different kinds, but often these groups can contain as many as 30 different kinds of birds. And what really interested me about these groups was in how do birds decide who to choose? Who do they choose to group with? Now, birds join these groups for two reasons. One, that some of them get better, are able to feed better, feed more efficiently when they are part of these groups. They're able to use the other species to gain food. Others use the group for safety and protection. By being in the company of others, they're better protected from predators. And a choice that all these species have to make is whether to group with birds that are similar to themselves or to group with birds that are very different from themselves. And the outcome of this choice results in different benefits. So by associating with other birds that are similar to themselves, the benefits that they get are in some sense incremental. The group size increases, there are more eyes to look out for predators, the individuals together can find food better. By grouping with other species that are very different from themselves, they might get access to new resources, they get access to new information. But before that can happen, they have to overcome a lot of barriers. They have to adjust their activities to other species, they have to learn to recognize the language of other species and so on. So this is a situation which is sort of strikingly similar to the situation that the fellows had to were in the restaurant. They had to make this choice of sitting with people who are very similar to themselves or with people who are very different from themselves. So I thought it would be interesting to actually go out, try and understand the assembly of these social foraging groups of humans. And it was sort of an obvious thing for me to do, but given my own background. It was relatively easy to do because the methods to do this I was familiar with. I could apply the same methods to these human social foraging groups. And so I decided to carry out this project in the Wissenschaftskolleg restaurant during my stay there. And what I was really interested in was in looking at the relationship between the similarity of these fellows in terms of the academic disciplines they come from and how they associate. Do people tend to sit with others from their own disciplines, or do they choose to sit with people from other disciplines? Right? So that was the question I was really interested in. But I must admit, I'm saying all this today, but at that point, the idea for this project and my decision to do it really came about in a moment of desperation. Like I said, I joined in September 2013, and around November 2013, the main research project for which I'd gone to the Wissenschaftskolleg for was failing. I wasn't really going anywhere with it. And for want of distraction more than anything else, I thought this would be an interesting thing to do. And though as I went about doing it, I also learned a lot of things about my own research project, which I'll tell you a little about in the end. So I'm just saying this out. So like I was saying, what I was interested in is to see whether fellows who are more similar are likely to associate more, or do we find the opposite pattern? Fellows who are more similar associate less. So I'll just briefly tell you about the methods I used. And this project would not have been possible without this person. Lena Mauer is the manager of the restaurant at the Wissenschaftskolleg. And after I decided to do this project, I realized that I need help with collecting the data. Since I was going to be present at all these meals, during the meals, sitting at these tables, it would be very difficult for me to collect this data on my own. So what I needed was someone to help me actually collect this information about the composition of these different tables. So I went up to Lena and said that this is what I'm interested in doing and whether she would help me. She immediately said yes. She said, I'll do it, but I'll do it on one condition, that I will be the first author on the paper that comes out of this study. She said, I know you academic types, this order of authorship matters a lot. So if a paper comes out of this study, I will be first after all. So based on those conditions, though I wasn't very happy about it, I agreed because I didn't have a choice then. So what Lena did at every meeting was to record who sat at each table. So this is an example of the data sheets, right? So Lena would record, once everyone was seated at the tables, she would record which fellow sat at which table, right? On some days, when she had the time and was feeling particularly creative, she would actually draw the tables out. On other days, she would just give me a list of the fellows, right? And she did this every day over 55 meetings, so 55 in data sets. And the data sets included information on 46 fellows. Now, of course, at these meals, there were people other than the fellows also. There were the partners and wives and husbands of these fellows. There were also staff from the Wissenschaftskolleg itself. But for the purpose of this talk, I'm only going to talk about the associations between the fellows themselves. And what the data that Lena recorded, like I was saying, was the location of each fellow at these tables. Who was sitting with whom? But there is a caveat. The caveat is this. Lena only recorded the arrangement at the end after all the fellows have gone and sat at the table. What we didn't record was the sequence of people coming to the tables. So if you think about it, the choice that each fellow has to make, the options available to each fellow is different because it depends on when you come into the restaurant. So if you come in first, you really don't have a choice. You just go and sit at one table. If you come in second, you can either sit at the table with the person present or at a new table, and so on, right? So that's one caveat to keep in mind. The other is that the choices could also be dependent on, when fellows arrive. So if suppose two fellows tended to walk to lunch from their offices together every day, and just the fact that they arrive at the restaurant at the same time could mean that they are sitting at the same table, right? So these are some caveats to keep in mind when thinking about the results of this analysis. So this is what the data look like. On each day, you have the composition of these fellows at these different tables. So table 1, these 4 people, table 2, and so on. And so this across 55 different days, right? And what I was interested in was to calculate an association strength for each pair of fellows. So just to give you an example, this is the data for this pair, Natasha Matre. I know some of you might be familiar. She was a student at CS. She was also a fellow at the same time. And Andrew Higginson, right? So what's the association strength of these two people? Okay? So this is the way I calculated. So on each day, I would check whether both fellows were present during the meal, whether they both were part of the meal, whether they were present at lunch or dinner. If they were present, only then did I include that day in my data, right? If they were absent, that day was excluded, right? And on the days when they are present, I looked at whether they sat at the same table or at different tables, right? And what I also recorded was the number of tables occupied on each day. And this is important because what I wanted to calculate was the probability that these two fellows sat together just by chance, okay? And the way I did that was that if there are 8 tables during a meal, what's the chance that the two of them would sit together just by chance? And the chance is just 1 over that number. So on this day, it's 1 over 8, 1 over 9, 1 over 7, and so on, right? And from this, what I wanted to find out was how often did these two people sit together at the same table in relation to what is just expected by chance. So the observed number of times the two fellows sat together, if you go back to the data, they sat together just once, and in relation to what's expected by chance. So it's 1 minus the expected number of co-occurrences over the expected co-occurrences. So it's observed minus expected by the expected co-occurrences. So this way, I calculated, so in this case, values over 0 means they tend to sit more than expected by chance. Values less than 0 means they tend to sit less than expected by chance. So this way, I calculated an association strength for every pair of fellows. And then, I was interested in relating this to their academic disciplines. So when I was a fellow there during that year, the fellows came from 11 different disciplines, dominated by historians and biologists. And so what I was interested in was for each pair to characterize them as coming from the same academic discipline or from different academic disciplines. So in the case of Matre and Higginson, they were both biologists, so the academic discipline is same. In the case of me and Babu, I'm a biologist, he's a historian, so the discipline is different, right? So you have one set of data which is fellows, pairs from the same academic discipline, another set which is pairs from different academic disciplines. Okay, so quickly to go over the results of this.
Is it okay to ask?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, feel free to ask.
Two questions. One is, did any of the fellows know that they were legal, sir?
I don't think so.
Including Natasha?
Including Natasha.
Okay.
Well, I knew. That was
Yeah, sure. But also, this will be affected by the number of people in a given discipline. The person, the writer, has no choice but to sit with someone outside his discipline.
So he would be only in the pairs, the different pairs.
So you would have to correct for that, right? Because my probability of sitting with somebody outside my discipline is very high if I'm the only or very few people in my discipline. If I'm a biologist, just by chance, or that's taken care of even by chance.
Yes, it's taken care of by chance. So the final analysis is not at the individual level. So it's at these categories. So it's comparison of pairs with same pairs and different pairs.
Nevertheless, if you had 46 fellows in 46 different disciplines,
right,
you would get a very different result than if you had 23 fellows from biologists and 23 historians. So is there some need to correct for that?
It's only the number. That would only change the number of pairs. So what I'm comparing is the average association strength of same pairs and different pairs. The situation you described would change the sample sizes of these two categories, but I'm not sure it would change the result itself. Whether it would make a difference to the result.
You can do a simulation and check it out.
Yeah.
What is a negative association?
So in if you look at the formula, what it means is that the number of times they sat together is less than what is expected just by chance.
Actually avoid.
So in case, if I didn't want to sit with someone at all and I made sure I sat at a different table, that would be negative association.
Just to add to what Arjun said, would you have similarity between, say, a literary person and a fine arts person? I mean, there's just one, but I mean, would they be similar? Or
Yeah, so the categories, the academic discipline categories are fairly broad. So these are the categories, right? So yeah, you could make this fine. I mean, in some sense, I was limited by information that was available, and I could make this finer by finding out more about these disciplines. But this analysis is done at this fairly broad categorization.
Since you're having a series of questions, can I add to that? Unlike in bird forms and unlike in group signals that the group of insects or birds produce, here you're constrained by the number of chairs on each table. So even if I want to sit at a table, it might be taken up by other
Birds would
things.
be constrained with the number of trees or number of
Possibly.
as much or more. Here we would add another table if some extra fellows came.
So
Nobody
yeah,
would do that.
I mean, in one sense,
But
as
if
you
somebody
said,
always shows up late, they could have a
so the
choice.
person, like I was saying, the choices available to each person is not the same. The person arriving first has no choice. He's sitting, he has to pick a table where there's no one. The person arriving last might just pick the table where there's a seat left. So one thing I need to say is that there are more chairs and more tables than are required. So usually only about 70 to 80% of the chairs are occupied. But though,
Don't you think that the initial position is a chaos? You have multiple factors acting, and you will never be able to exhaust the entire criteria which would be leading to the decision making. So initial position is actually a chaos. From that point, what is the nature's predictability about the whole thing?
So I'm not it's not clear to me what you mean when you say initial position is chaos.
Let's see, if you speak in terms of physics, now there should be mathematical clarity about the position and velocity, right? If that is precisely measured.
But aren't you going one step ahead? Because first we want to see whether there's a pattern, and then we'll try to explain why that pattern is. Maybe there is no pattern. I think we try to understand, document the pattern first, and then look for explanation. So I think at this stage, at least at this stage of the talk, is trying to tell us whether there is a pattern. Then if we start saying this is because physicists like biologists, then all the things that you say come into the picture. But to see whether in fact there is some association or there is some pattern can be kind of independent of the factors that lead to that pattern. I mean, we do this all the time in biology. We find patterns, and for less than 1% of them, we have even a plausible explanation. So the pattern documentation and the explanation really do not sort of go together most of the time historically.
Okay, the pattern. There seems to be a clear pattern of grouping within discipline. That fellows of the same academic discipline had much higher association strengths than fellows from different disciplines. And look at it statistically, do a randomization test, and this level of difference is not obtained even once in 1,000 trials. We randomize the identities of these pairs and do this analysis.
This is what I meant. So if you did this same study in a year, where there were 23 biologists and 23 historians and nobody else,
right,
you would never get this difference. You would not be able to get that difference.
But what is it about the data set itself which will not give such a difference? Because you're saying that
the difference is so high.
Right.
The same is so high. Right. Or if there were 23 disciplines with 2 people each.
Because of the number of seats at each table which need to be filled.
If there were 23 people,
right,
23 disciplines with 2 people each,
right,
you would never be able to sit. This bar would never be so high. It's not possible for this bar to be so high.
You could still have a situation where you're always sitting with someone
but
from your
the effort needed to make sure you sit with your own discipline is very high. Here, by chance alone, you will sit with your own discipline because there are 18 biologists.
Right.
I'm not sure uniformly whether that is taken care of.
So it's taken care of in some sense by the.
Do this study every year and then start making judgments about. I'm doing the same thing that I accused Rahil of going to explain. But suppose you do every year and you say this year people were much more adventurous of going to other disciplines. Last year they were not, and if you don't correct for the relative.
So I need to think about this. I don't know
it's
what way.
Relative abundance of your bird species. So if you have a population in which you have high diversity, species diversity, and one in which you have very low species diversity, but the same number of species, you might not be able to use this index to compare between these two populations.
So the calculation of expectation by chance, in some sense, accounts for that.
Maybe it is.
Because the probabilities of 2 fellows of in the second situation described, those probabilities will change
but you
accordingly.
Had the number of tables there. You did talk about the relative abundance of different disciplines in that formula. So exactly like if you think of a population with a high species diversity, low species diversity, same number of species, would this formula correct for that?
So in that formula, I don't talk about that. But in your expected values also, the number of samples of same and different would also be would change. Right? But I need to think about this. I'm sure the relative abundances of different disciplines makes a difference.
Yes. No, I'm not
whether
saying
it biases it in any particular direction, I'm not sure.
Actually, what Raji is saying to some extent is taken care of in the distribution this particular year, because 2 disciplines seem to be so dominant in terms of numbers. But I have another question, and that is the 14 photograph that you showed initially of the dining room, as well as Lena's diagram, seemed to show that some tables were relatively large, or they were combined together. So then that changes things in many ways. Secondly, the position of those tables, particularly if the sizes of the tables were different, also affects the thing. I wondered whether you looked at those kinds of.
No, but Hari, what we're telling you, I think what Hari is not telling you, it is a situation extremely simple in this restaurant compared to these words. It is so much more complicated, so many other imponderable factors, much more. This is actually a very simplified situation.
That's why I was saying that it also makes me rethink all my inferences about workshop. Yeah, sure.
In the case of birds, with the knowledge power regarding the possibility of commensality, mutuality, reciprocity, cooperation, various possibilities can be delimited, and then depending upon that, explanation is possible. But in the case of human beings, these sort of things like commensality or mutuality, symbiosis, and all such things will not work, because one thing, you cannot have a kind of species-oriented explanation in the case of human at the individual level, and also from day-to-day factors. It may be from academic to coinophiliac issues.
Actually, I don't have an explanation. I just have the pattern. I don't have. I mean, I'm going to speculate about what it might be.
Pattern, as Arji said, pattern itself is a very fluid kind. There doesn't exist a pattern. It is just the output. If a pattern should be something explicable, because you identify it as a pattern, which means the pattern can be destructured into constituent elements, and then there is a pattern of organization of the constituent elements. That way, the ordering process is something which is defined, and then you explain on the basis of that. Otherwise, there exists pattern everywhere.
Sure.
You identify a pattern because of the determinant aspect of the ordering or the structuring of the constituent elements of the pattern.
Even if you have no idea about the process, you could still unravel patterns. What you're saying is that it makes no sense unless, are you saying it doesn't mean anything unless you have an idea about the.
No, what I'm saying is that we start with a position which cannot be managed, and therefore I call it an initial position which is chaos. Then you go to a point which is not a final point, because you do not have, you started with no premise, and then therefore there is no conclusion.
No,
Every time there
many people would not agree with you. People have discovered patterns 200 years ago. We're still trying to explain how that pattern comes about. So it's not necessary to have an explanation before something qualifies to be called a pattern. That's not how science
But
works.
unless the pattern recurs, how can we call it as a pattern?
So you can say that he should do this study. That's why he has taken 46 days of data. He's not taken 1 day's data. So you can say, also you can say you must do this for many more years. That's a different issue. But the claim that a pattern is not a pattern unless we have an explanation is not tenable in science, because we find patterns and then we have no idea what the explanation is. It may take 200 years to explain. People found that there is a certain pattern in which sunspots occur on the sun. And nobody knew what it was, why it works. Even today people are debating why there is a certain cycle of sunspots in the sun. Nobody knows. Even today there is being discussed. But nobody says this is not a pattern. It is because they recognize there is a pattern that 200 years of solar physics happened. Nobody knows what the pattern is. And there the chaos, of course, is even much more. When people first defined the pattern, they didn't even know that there was a magnetic field in the sun. But they recorded the pattern. That's the pattern. So every time there was a solar flare, there was some electrical disturbance in some part of the Earth. This was a recurring pattern. Nobody knew what it is. Most people said this is complete coincidence. There cannot be any connection between what happens on the sun and what happens on Earth. After 200 years, today we know that in fact, if there is a solar flare in the sun, it can knock off electricity on Earth. We know that today. After 200 years of searching for a cause for this pattern. But we still called it a pattern. That whenever there is some disturbance on the sun, the lights go off in some part of the Earth.
about the pattern of birds flying? They are formations.
That's another kind of pattern.
Okay, and in that kind of intelligibility, will we be able to associate these so-called patterns?
Absolutely. Many people are trying to do that. Many people are studying the pattern in which birds fly and trying to understand why they fly there. But the pattern in which birds fly have been recorded 1,000 years ago. And even today we are struggling to explain why that pattern comes. So for example, when these birds fly in a V shape, this has been recorded, I don't know, 1,000 years ago. Even today we don't have a good enough explanation. But the entire effort of science is to explain observed patterns. So we do not think that we should not label something as a pattern until we have an explanation. Because then we will never start anywhere. So the way we work is that we identify a pattern based on...
I'm not saying that the very purpose of the pattern should be explicable. No, that is not my idea. Pattern should be subjected to reduction of constituents of the pattern. What makes the pattern? That's the only thing. It's only the morphological issue that I am facing. If you have a pattern, then that pattern is made up of what? These elements, if you reduce in terms of human elements, now just branding sociology or history or biology will not do.
Let me see if Hari agrees with my explanation. What he is doing, he is basically saying, if I throw dice, then there is different, I can calculate different probabilities of getting different outcomes. So I throw dice and I get different outcomes. And he is looking at what outcomes you get, and the outcomes he gets are not consistent with the laws of chance that you would expect. So basically he is assuming that people are sitting there exactly like how the dice would fall. Is it like that? And he's saying it's not. The probability of getting different outcomes when you throw dice, it can be calculated statistically, and he's getting a pattern which deviates from that. Is that
Yes,
that's all he's saying.
And I'm using academic discipline and other variables to describe the pattern, but of course whether those are actually responsible for the pattern itself cannot be got from just this data. This is just a description of people sitting at a table in terms of academic discipline, in terms of other variables. But whether those variables are in fact responsible for the way they're sitting is not something you can get from this. But with many, like in ecology especially, in many of these cases, this is sort of like a best guess. It's not ideal, but you try and infer based on these patterns what might be underlying them, because you can't really get down to the building blocks and actually work out what the like you're saying, the morphology of it is.
Perhaps we can get through the rest of the talk and point
Sure.
out to you.
So this is in terms of academic discipline, there seems to be a tendency for people to sit with others from their own academic discipline rather than from different academic disciplines. But what about other variables? People are more than just their academic disciplines. What if you look at other variables, gender and nationality? So people during this year came from 19 different countries, again mainly from the US and followed by Germany and India. So what do you find when you look at this pattern in terms of nationality? You find something similar, that fellows tended to say that the association, okay, let me rephrase it, the association strength of fellows from the same country was higher on average than fellows from different countries. What about age? There was a fairly wide variation in age. Most fellows were between the ages of 30 and 60. And if you look at it in terms of age, there is a weak relationship that fellows more similar in age tended to have association strength, but this is really weak. I mean, it's not a very strong relationship between age and association strength. Right? And finally, what about gender? There are many more male fellows than female fellows, but there really is no pattern. There is no tendency for fellows to assort based on gender. There is not a strong difference between fellows from the same gender and fellows from different genders. So just to summarize that, again, based on the discussion we just had, maybe the word influence is wrong, but the correlate of these patterns, that academic discipline seems to be a strong correlate, and nationality seems to be a strong correlate, age not so much, and gender not at all. Now, in a typical ecological study, one would look at this and interpret. Let me tell you what I did when I studied the bird flocks. I had similar traits with which I looked at similarities between species. I had body size, I had foraging behavior, the heights at which birds forage, and I looked at whether birds that are similar in these traits associated more than birds that are dissimilar. And I found that that was the case, that in general, birds that are similar associate more than birds that are dissimilar. And then I tried to interpret it in terms of these individual variables. But in this case, now I thought about these patterns quite a bit. And then I also went and thought about, because this is a unique case where I'm not just the researcher, but also a subject of the research. So I went and thought about what I did during these lunches. How did I pick who I sat with? Who are the closest associates in my case? And so this is just an illustration of that. Of course, there's the caveat that because I knew I was doing this, maybe I influenced the data. There's no way to counter that. But my associations, two things to maybe suggest that that might not be the case is that I maintained a daily, before I started this in November, I maintained a daily record of who I sat with even before that, just like a diary. And these people tended to be among my, among the people I sat with regularly. And also, if you look at the patterns itself, they sort of bear out what is seen in general. I'm a biologist, I tended to sit with biologists, I tended to sit with people from my own country, I tended to sit with people sort of who are similar to me in age. But I also thought about, we're thinking about this in terms of academic disciplines and thinking about it in terms of what the Wissenschaftskolleg wants to achieve. But I thought about what is it that we really discussed during lunch. And we spoke about many different things. We spoke about movies, we spoke about novels, we spoke about sport, we spoke about food. Occasionally we spoke about our subjects as well. And based on this, and based on what I remember of these conversations with these people, I'm wondering if these variables itself, the academic discipline and nationality, these results are open to interpretation from everyone, but I'm just speculating here, whether these variables, more than meaning something in themselves, are really surrogates or proxies for something else. And what that something else might be is, really a sense of familiarity and comfort. If you think about biologists, why is it that I sit with biologists? It's not, I don't think it was so much to discuss biology, but it's just that biologists tend to be similar in other ways. They tend to be informal, they tend to share a lot of stories, they tend to be gentle, easygoing. And maybe this is what attracted me to other biologists. Familiarity. Natasha is someone I've known for a long period of time. Whether it's to do with her being a biologist that I sat with her, I don't know. And again, for people from country, this is just based on some observations, I found that people from the US tended to be a lot more easygoing, easy to talk to, a lot less formal, whereas people from some other countries tended to be more formal. So all of these, nationality and discipline and language, whether in some sense they are proxies, a surrogate of familiarity and comfort, more than anything else. But again, this is just me speculating on what could be the explanation for these based on my own experiences. What I want to do is to also maybe ask the other fellows what they thought. They still don't know that I've done this study. And before they get to know, before they see the article I've written based on it, maybe I could ask them how they chose.
Are you applying for the lecture?
No, just no, I want to conduct an online questionnaire survey asking them how do they think they chose their tables. What factors might have been important for them. But what do the results mean for the Wiko? I mean, if you look at it immediately, it might be a little disheartening for the Wiko in some sense, because really it's a place where the institute really wants people from different disciplines to, they want dialogue across disciplines. And here you have a situation where everyone seems to be grouping with people who are similar to themselves. So what does it mean for the Wiko? I don't know if they can really do anything different. I mean, it's something that maybe the institute needs to be aware of, that there is maybe this tendency to group with like people. But beyond that, one could think of an extreme situation where the Wissenschaftskolleg decides that they will decide who sits with whom. You will today sit with a historian, an economist, and you will discuss this. But that's an extreme situation. I don't think that if you know human behavior, you'll know that the minute you are asked to do something, you'll do just the opposite. So that won't work. But is there anything from this that the Wissenschaftskolleg can learn? I don't know. So for instance, maybe the fact that you tend to associate both with nationality and discipline might suggest that if you have a mix of disciplines from the same country, maybe that's one barrier crossed. That you have a pool of people who are familiar with each other already and who are likely to. But I really think that, more than, they really can't, the Wissenschaftskolleg really doesn't need to do anything different, but just be aware that, that there are these barriers to, that need to be crossed, and that it's an inefficient system of maybe encouraging dialogue across disciplines, but it's really the best you can do without forcing people to sort of come together. The other thing I want to do is to look at this in terms of the network of associations, and in this sense, this is basically the network of the really strong associations, people who tended to associate twice as much as expected by chance. And I'm not an expert on networks. Ferenc helped me build this network, and he looked at this network and said, the Wissenschaftskolleg can be fairly happy with this, because what you could have a situation where these different groups break up into cliques and there's no connections at all. But here you find a situation where everyone is connected, which means that that there is talk across people, that people, though you have these tendencies for associating with people from your own discipline, it's not like they're broken up completely into groups. So maybe this is the best we can do. What might be interesting is to find out the most central nodes in these. The key players here to sort of connect groups. Maybe the Wissenschaftskolleg can give them special awards, bringing everyone together. So this is my last slide, and like I said, I started this off as a fun project, really for want of distraction more than anything else. But like I was saying, it also makes me think a little more about interpretations of my own results with regard to these flocks. I thought of these flocks in terms of these traits, these species traits, large and small birds, birds that feed by catching insects in the air, birds that glean from leaves. But now I also think about other variables that might be important. For instance, at the individual level, I was thinking about these as these species, but at the individual level, maybe things like familiarity make a difference. Maybe birds will pick individuals that they've lived close to for long periods of time. Maybe that familiarity is important, being around another individual for a long period of time. Maybe the matching of personalities of these birds is also important, irrespective of which species they come from. And so, I think that we tend often in science to focus on things that are easily measurable, easily quantifiable, and things that are accessible. But often these other factors which are not so easily accessible might be also playing a very important role. I will stop with that, and I have two people to thank. One is Archie, because he was the person who initially suggested that I apply for this fellowship and is responsible for me being there. And of course Lena, without whom none of this would have been possible, and who will be the first author on a paper that comes out. Thank you so much.
Plenty of time for comments. Because I want to start.
Very just a question, following up on the broader discussion which we had sometime before. We also want to take into account the personality type. Suppose, if I imagine myself, sitting in a situation like this, someday I might want to discuss something of my discipline. Some other day I might want to, meet and talk about other disciplines, learn from others. So, or maybe today I'm a little, not in a mood to talk much. So do you also want to take into account?
I think that's important, but I've only used variables which are available. So the information that I've used here is that which is publicly available, and other things like what you're talking about are difficult to quantify unless you actually go and ask people, do a question and stuff. So yes, I think they are definitely important, but it's just that it's difficult to get that kind of information.
But going beyond that, is it true that when we realize that there are these other variables which we cannot deal with, we are making the assumption that it all sort of cancels out? Okay, it cancels out. So there's no reason to expect that only biologists will be moody people. So we expect that these things just cancel out and they will not affect the results in this way. So everybody will have a bad day, everybody will have sometimes want to talk. So that should not affect, that's the assumption that they make, that it should not affect the overall result, because it should be true everywhere, it should sort of balance out. Now, that it balances out is a different story, but that's the kind of implicit assumption we make. See, one of the nice things about doing this on humans is that you begin to ask questions whether what you're doing is right, which you probably don't ask with the birds, because the birds are not here to complain. And it helps you to start thinking about how you do with birds and reflect on what you decide. So when we do with birds, there are lots of such things. A bird may be sick one day, a bird may be young. So we assume that all of this sort of balances out, and it is not true only of one class, and it doesn't affect the overall results. Now, if you say that some students fall sick because on the day of the exam, we assume that sometimes the bright students will fall sick, sometimes the weak students will fall sick, anybody may fall sick, and overall it doesn't matter, it sort of cancels out. This is the kind of assumption we make, and we must be making the assumption implicitly for many, many variables. There are lots of other people raising hands.
Yeah, okay, so very important. I found myself in this situation umpteen times. So what I've noticed is things start with status. That's an important factor. And over time, things also change. It's not like it stays static. But I've noticed there is a first world, third world. Let's say I was once at a conference of urbanists where I noticed that in the beginning all the third world countries were chatting with each other. Not because their interests were common, but really it is a matter of, I think the American scholars were kind of, more respected or whatever, they had views in. But it changed very rapidly. And by the end, it was, you could see different things happening. But so I was wondering with your birds actually, first of all, does status matter and how do you even think about it?
Well, status, across species, I don't know how we think about it, but status does matter, within species. There are documented cases of real hierarchies among individuals, often groups of the same species. Across species, because you have, both positive and negative interactions, and you could have the levels of aggression across species varying depending on things like how big or small a bird is, how aggressive it is, and so on. But yeah, it's not something I looked at in the study I did. But the point you make about things not being static, I think is very important. That if you do the same thing as snapshots from the start of the fellowship till the end, I think you'll find the patterns very different. So I think you might find these towards the end these really strong associations that sort of form, and people tend to sit together, the same people all the time. But things tended to be, this is just qualitative observation, but things tended to be more fluid in the beginning. And also, I think, like you're saying, familiarity makes a lot of difference. So the people you happen to meet initially on the first few days when you're there, you tended to, you go back, you meet someone on the first 2 days, you go back the third day. There's a tendency for you to look for somebody who you're familiar with, and that could make a difference. So these initial conditions could make a difference as well.
Raja, Uday, Chetan, Rangana. That's the question.
So one of the thing could be that the kind of discussion that previously was discussed, or probably like you have not completed the discussion on that particular day.
Continue the fight.
Yeah, continue the fight. Can that be one of the?
I have no way of knowing. There could be cases where people said, okay, we'll come back tomorrow and discuss
So
this.
on a time series, if you look at it, probably then you will have a pairing in a different way.
Right, across days.
Yeah, across.
That's true.
Actually, my question, it's not a question, a very interesting talk. One point I wanted to ask you was, you left out the spouses, who would come with them. Now, did you deliberately, you obviously deliberately left them out, would including them would have influenced the behavior of people to choose their table?
The reason I'm
asking you that because how many spouses did you miss out? I mean, how many did they come?
Quite a few. The reason I left them out was that their positions were most of the time not independent of their.
Yeah, so they moved with the people, with their,
So
the husbands
in
and
some
wives or the
sense
partners
affect-
moved.
yeah.
So if they did, would one of the partners be influencing? Did you? I don't know whether you noticed it. Did that happen that the partner was actually driving the person to a table rather than?
No, I have no way of knowing that.
No.
Yeah, so I don't know if it's a decision made by the fellow or the fellows.
A second point I just wanted to make quickly was: were people sitting in the same place?
Yeah.
Would they take up the tables they were familiar with?
Whether they have a preference for a particular table.
Yeah.
Again, from what I remember, I don't think so, but
No, from the scatter diagram you have.
In the colloquium, yes.
in the colloquium, so in the talks, yes, people tended to have favorite spots, but I don't know. Do you think
I
they had?
certainly have the exactly same place where I sit
In the colloquium.
and I go early.
Yeah. So in fact,
In the restaurant?
No, in the restaurant.
no, in fact, my question was driven to that. Comfort and familiarity is this. I have seen in many conferences that a delegate or a student is very familiar and very hot spot, like left-right bias, or the corner spot, or where the light is more, or where he can quickly go off. This was observed all the 3 days during the conferences. And I think so you can glean out some of these information basing on your data so as to a person was particularly sitting in those areas and let people come to me instead of I going to them kind of thing.
Yeah, so I have information on the tables they sat at, so it's something I could look at.
Yeah.
But I from what I remember, I don't think that was the case. But yeah.
So it could not have been the case with all of them, but
Yeah, sure.
perhaps one or two, a few of them per table would say, I only like this table.
Supported your observation. We had a similar experience in Goethe Institute, where we were asked to learn German for 3 months to 4 months. Usually, it will have postdocs from 20 to 25 different countries. To start with, we prefer to have associations because German was the language which we didn't know, and our language which we can communicate was English. Those who know English used to assemble together. But believe me, by the end of the 4th month or the 3rd month, it's a dynamic process. We started looking for the comfort zone now. Who can teach us German? And things evolved. In fact, most of the Goethe institutes have plotted this data. So they wanted to go always with the people who doesn't speak English, so that we'll pick up German. So the pattern will not be static.
Yeah,
Changes work.
I think he's been forced to collapse the entire his stay to
I don't have enough
Yes.
information.
Hari, can you get to that graph you clustered?
The network.
Yeah, the network. So, are the outliers who have just a connectivity of 2, are they principally from the singleton disciplines? The disciplines in which there's just
Not easily find
Last one,
because people on periphery of this diagram are not necessarily.
no, not. I'm talking about connectivity of 2.
Whether the people with fewer links are, I don't think there's a tendency here. That's one is one of the prominent fellows. But I'm trying to find someone. So this
Babu
he was
has-
the sole representative of his discipline.
And of his continent.
And of his continent. Yeah. But I'll have to look it up. I don't relate number of people. I don't know. I can't tell immediately.
Yes.
I want to go back to Archie's original question, and I think that also relates to Professor Gurukul's question about whether there are patterns, and so some clarification about how you calculated the expected would really help. So So let's assume we walk into a room with lots of people, and let's assume all the biologists are wearing red shirt, and all the historians are wearing a green shirt, and economists pink, and so on. Right? So you go and let's say Hari sits next to Natasha, both of you are biologists, and you calculate the association index value for Natasha and Hari. Perfectly valid way of doing this. But let's assume that but we know that there is an asymmetry in the number of biologists and, in terms of which disciplines people belong to. Let's assume that you walk into this dining hall and the decision you make about where to sit is completely independent of who is sitting next to you. In that case, there should be no pattern. But I think that the pattern will arise purely because there are more historians and purely because there are more biologists. And so can you draw the conclusion that biologists tend to aggregate together and historians tend to aggregate together?
But that purely by chance will get reflected in the expected value of association.
But you're calculating just one expected value, and you're looking at nationality, you're looking at which discipline they belong to, and you're looking at...
But one expected value based on the identity of that person. So for each pair, one expected value...
Can you tell me how you would calculate the expected?
Maybe if you go back to your formula.
For a particular pair, like I said, the data was restricted to the days when those two people were present at. And then I looked at, during that meal, how many tables were used, right? And so I calculated the expected value as the probability of the two of them sitting at the table just by chance.
That's what I'm saying. So you are correcting for the fact that there are 8 tables and I couldn't sit at all of them. And there was a certain 1 by 8 chance that I'll sit at a table. But what I was saying and what Karthik is saying now is that this doesn't correct for the variation in the number of people from different disciplines. And I think Karthik pointed out something which I had not realized. If in fact you're correcting for that, then you have to recalculate the association when you're looking at nationality versus when you're looking at discipline. Because there the expected value will be totally different. Because if there are many more Americans, and then the expected value that an American sits with an American by chance alone is totally different from the expected value that a biologist will sit with a biologist because of the number of biologists. So you cannot use the same association index to examine. That's what Karthik pointed. I had not thought of
Yes, you use the same association
you
index
can't.
value.
Obviously, you're not
Because
correcting for that.
the expectation is calculated for the individual identities and not based on discipline or nationality. So I'm trying to think of what might be another way to calculate expectation in this case.
What you are calculating
because you're not the problem is that you're not making a choice based on individual.
Yes.
Your choice is only based on the table.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
So you're not saying, so if it was a situation where you're saying that if hypothetically, if each person who comes in had to pick one lunch partner, then you could calculate based on the numbers. But here, the only thing the person is choosing is the table.
If this was your head-on birds, and each discipline represented a species, and the number of fellows in that discipline represented the number of birds, and you were calculating association in feeding flock, is this a formula you would use?
I would use this to, I would use this to say, what's the chance of two birds being present in the same group?
But it does not correct for the fact that because there are more birds of one species, inevitably they will have a higher association.
Especially when the distribution is so skewed.
Yeah, exactly, because the distribution is skewed. So it seems to me that it does not, in fact, I thought it was not correct, but now I'm convinced that it is not correct because of what Karthik said, namely that if in fact it was corrected, you cannot use the same association to look for the effect of discipline versus the effect of gender or effect of nationality. Because there, the chance that I'll sit with another American just by chance alone is a very different quantity than the chance I'll sit with another biologist just by chance alone. These two quantities are not the same.
No, but it would be, when the analysis is at the level of pairs of fellows, I'm wondering if that's taken care of in the expected value, because you have so many, your number of expected values for also varies depending on the distribution of these disciplines.
It's the difference between
the asymmetry is also represented in the.
I think you should do some simulation. That should really help you to tease this out. But we must move on to other people. Yes, please.
Among the many variables and criteria that go into a decision making for this, some of the major ones would be the location of the entry and the exit. It's a temperate zone country, so I presume, I don't know, it must be a closed place, cold place, so it will be closed, there will be an entry and an exit. And when you enter, if it's a quick lunch, it will be a different decision. If it's a leisurely lunch, it will be a different decision. Everyone turns to look at you. Then the social factor. In some social norms, if there is a 4-chair table and 3 are occupied, and you go and take a table that is khali, you are conveying a message that I don't want to sit here. And that in an institute, I don't know the norms there. In that institute, you're not going to be very happy thereafter. I mean, there are these 3 people sitting, and you already made a statement saying, I don't want to sit with you, I'm going to have lunch there. So the social norms of the place, the amount of time, it's a quick lunch, leisurely lunch. The entry-exit point is very important, because when you enter and you make a noise, everyone looks at you, and you've already announced your presence. Your choices are limited after that. If supposing there is a table, you're entering from behind, and the table has 3 people, you can quietly go and slink into one of the empty tables, push off after your lunch. But if the entry is in front of these 3 people, you cannot. Generally, I don't know about, I'm sure Germany, the norms are they're very social. So you have no choice now, you have to be the 4th person in that table. So the innumerable criteria for this sort of a thing.
So one thing I did notice was that people did choose to go and sit at tables which didn't have anyone. So if you had a situation where, there were 3 people at a table and 1 empty chair, especially initially, if you had 3 people and 1 empty chair, there were lots of cases where people went and started a new table. Of course, if you're coming towards the end and you pick a table where no one is, you're the last person. And I know this from personal experience. It's not looked upon very favorably. So people will come and inquire, ask you if you're not well, what's wrong. So yeah, so that has happened. But people do sort of see new tables when it's still, when people are still setting up. For the entrance and exit, well, there's just one door, and there's a long lunch counter where people come pick up their trays. So yes, of course, things like, which table is visible and whether those people can see you if they're right next to you, those are factors which may probably make a difference, but I have no way of telling that.
And also the first month when you reach the institute, you would behave differently. And at the end of the course, it'll be a totally different scenario.
Sure. It's just that my stay there was short, and I also started this project, 2 months into my stay, so I don't have enough resolution to look at it temporarily. But yes, it will make a difference. I think it will make a difference whether you're looking at it or not.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. It's a bird question. I want to ask you, can you give an equivalent of bird behavior in the course of your research, which sort of approximated to this, when there's a dominant group, 2 dominant groups, and the rest of them are less? I'm curious to know what you derive what you are deriving from your avian.
2 dominant, or like in the case of the academic disciplines, the 2. I don't have a directly comparable situation. But yeah, you could, in my data, I'll have to go back and look at it, but you could have a situation where most species come from a particular category of foraging behavior. So almost all the birds that participate in these groups are insect-eating birds, and insect eaters can be categorized into different foraging behavior types. So there are some birds that are active on the plants, they keep hopping around and pick insects off the leaves. There are others that sit and wait, and then they go and catch insects from the air. So birds that are active tend to be more numerous than birds that sit and wait. So yes, in my data also, I had a situation where certain foraging behavior types was, but I mean, this is something I'll have to go back and check. I don't know how it affected the results itself. That made a difference to the family results.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. It was obviously a fun project, and you communicated that very well. And it's quite an imaginative project. But I would have thought that you might have found the randomness of it all rather difficult to really overcome. I mean, I thought it's very, very random. Just looking at it, table-wise, day-wise, and discipline-wise. I've tried hard, but I didn't think I could make much out of it. And obviously, you would know this best. I thought if you really wanted quote-unquote results, probably a mathematical way where you calculate it would probably give you some result that was more concrete. Not that necessarily you're looking for concrete results, I don't see why, but if, assuming, since you are tabulating things, then there is some element of looking at something more concrete than just the random, but one didn't quite get beyond that.
So, I did try to, I mean, the calculation of expected values was to get at what one would expect just from random sorting. So, and the formula I used was maybe, I mean, based on the discussions, maybe there are other ways to do this, but I tried to calculate what is expected just by random to see if all of this is random with respect to these variables. And then so all the results at present is in relation to what's expected just at random. So if you look at the graphs and the values that here, this is just the number of times they sat together. From the previous data, these two fellows sat together just once. So I didn't use the raw value, but I calculated for these two fellows what is the likelihood that they sat together just by chance. And then the value I used was in relation to that expectation by chance. So in some sense I tried to get at what is random, but yes, there might be other ways to do this.
And one other thing, this is really more for Wissenschaftskolleg, not for you, but you did raise this important question. Is Wiko really getting what they want out of it? Now, the other kind of fellows, dons, teachers, and students communicating around meals is quite part of many Western universities. Oxbridge specialized in this almost. Specialized not in any negative sense. It's a tradition. But there, you never are expected to talk shop about your subject during your meals. At meals, you really do talk about other things of interest, whereas Wiko expects, from what you said, just the reverse in a sense.
Well, you might be able to say more about this, but given that this is the only time when fellows really meet,
yes.
I'm guessing that the Wiko would like them to talk some shop, but there are no restrictions.
Actually, there were restrictions.
Yeah, but given their motivations to do this and given what they want to achieve with this institute, I'm guessing that the Wiko hopes that there is some discussion of.
Given that this is much more interdisciplinary than Oxford or Cambridge, here the definition of talk shop becomes different. So if you're a historian and I'm a biologist, and either we talk history or we talk biology, we consider as talk shop or not. If two biologists meet each other to talk biology, that's clearly talk shop. If they talk about films, then it is not talking shop. But when a historian meets a biologist, what is the definition of talking shop? So what Wiko hopes is that when a biologist and historian meet, they either talk biology or history and not just about films. That is what Wiko hopes. So it becomes a little difficult to decide whether that is talking shop or not. One of them is talking about their discipline, but the other one is from a different discipline.
I get your point, but it's still kind of bringing your work to the dinner table.
Yes.
And that is probably what is discouraged.
Yes.
And I was just wondering whether giving freedom.
And one can see the reason for that. If we have a slightly disciplinarily homogeneous group, we would like them not to talk about their work. But if you have a disciplinarily heterogeneous group, we would actually like them to talk about their work, because for every person who is talking shop, for the other person is exactly the opposite of talking shop. So in sense, as a policy, one would encourage people to talk shop if we know that they are sitting with people from other disciplines. One would discourage them from talking shop if we know that they're sitting with the same discipline people. And if you have a very homogeneous environment, likely everybody is sitting with their own discipline, and we would like to discourage talking shop. If it's a very heterogeneous group, likely people are sitting with other disciplines, and we would like them to encourage them to talk shop. So talking shop has two completely different consequences depending on whether the group is homogeneous or group is heterogeneous. What do you say?
I get that point. To all intents and purposes, I think in a university situation, at a dining table, it's not all that homogeneous by way of disciplines. And therefore, I just want to end with this little question. Do you think then just to let that freedom be is better? In similar cultural and social context. That yes, there is an institute which values this, bringing people together, getting them to sit together and eat a meal, because that's the nicest.
Exactly.
But then, just really to let be.
Let be, yeah.
Yes. Whether that.
That's what we do. We don't.
Yes.
We don't insist on anything. We don't even insist what they should. The only thing we insist is that they should come to the meals, and we insist that in a very interesting way. We take away from their stipend the cost of the meals, whether you attend or not. And so it's a kind of incentive for you to eat, because you're paying for it anyway. That's the only thing that we do.
So we meaning we could.
Yeah. Sorry, I see.
Yes. Yes, of course.
Yes, that's right. So people pay for their meals, so there's an incentive to come. Ready?
Yeah. This is extending what you said before this to some extent. And you said one of the requirements was sitting in at these meals, 3 lunches and 1 dinner, and sitting in at the talks, initial talks.
4 lunches and
Actually 4 lunches and dinner, yes.
I wonder if we could look at it from the other perspective, sitting in on these talks. Is it that biologists generally ask questions of biologists? Or is it that historians sometimes ask questions of biologists during these talks, after the talk? And if, anecdotally, whether you'd seen some of that being extended to the dining table later. And the reason I'm asking this is, I've looked at this in a much more informal way. The Azim Premji University in Bangalore is currently located temporarily at a PES Institute of Technology campus. And in the cafeteria, I noticed that the two groups don't mix at all. And although,
what are the...
Well, the Azim Premji University students are primarily doing their MA, few doing their working to their doctorates, and then there are faculty, etc. Whereas the PS people are predominantly undergraduates. But undergraduates typically only doing engineering or something related. They don't have any interaction with each other. And I asked some of them, why don't you talk to the other people? Or, you can come up with 100 different reasons. That's very different from here, where you're expected to interact with each other. If we go back to my first question, the second one is really a comment. Did you notice anything like that?
Yeah, what really struck me was how much people from other disciplines were asking questions. Both in the case of when biologists were giving talk, others asking questions, and when actually more in that case. When there were lots of questions from other disciplines when biologists were giving talks, and the discussions tended to, so the talks every week happen on Tuesdays just before lunch, and on that day you would find that most of the discussion at lunch would be around the talk itself.
So to some extent, the attempt to integrate people at a dining table or tables is relatively trivial because this thing is already happening. When the formal talks are being given.
It's happening in a very focused way in relation to the topic being presented. Whereas at the lunch table, discussions could be sort of much broader. On Tuesdays, immediately after the talk and during the lunch following the talk, discussions tended to center around the talk itself. But on other days, it would be discussions about the subjects, not necessarily on a particular topic.
But there is no attempt to make them do anything during the lunch. The only attempt is to make them have lunch. And if you didn't do that, then the spillover effect that you're describing won't happen anyway. So we're just allowing that spillover to happen. But no conscious effort is being made anything about the interaction.
No, I don't mean that. I thought one of the objectives of Wiko is to have people of different disciplines interacting with each other.
Correct.
So whether it's interacting during a talk or whether it's interacting on the dining table or otherwise is not so important.
Sure.
And anyway, I think other people need to ask questions.
I had one question.
There are two people who have already asked before anybody else, otherwise we have to go. Yes.
Actually, your data is extremely interesting for a different purpose altogether. You see, you have one Zimbabwean, for example, there. How he or she moved around the tables. What were their comfort zones? There were single nationalities there. And you have a dominant US nationality. I'd like to see how they were melding into the group as time went, in your time frame. Would that scatter diagram, so familiar of parents, throw something light on that?
I'm sure it could. So, yeah, just from this.
Let's just take the Zimbabwean one.
So isn't this one result? This is actually calculated for every day. You don't need more data.
You have it.
Thing can be calculated for each day.
A first author paper for you.
That's just the composition. That'd be 7 or 8 different tables.
No, this thing.
If I calculate it for each day, it would be independent networks at each table, right?
No, how do you calculate this one?
This is across all 55 days.
That doesn't matter, but it's still the same data.
I know, but if it's just one day, I would have as many groups as the number of tables.
Because there will be no
connections across the
connections across.
Unless the tables are adjacent to your
I agree. Yeah.
So, just from what I've observed, I can say that for the Zimbabwean,
every day was different.
Towards the end, there was a really strong association between the Zimbabwean and the South African. But that could be, I'm talking in terms of nationalities, it could be in terms of 20 other variables. But yeah, there was a strong association between the Zimbabwean and the South African.
There's very strong association between the Indians and the Pakistanis.
Always.
I can tell you. In fact, the best friends for Indians were people from Pakistan and vice versa. Yes. Yes, what?
The 2 points that came out regarding talking shop. Here, the stated objective of the institute is inter and cross-disciplinary interaction. If I'm right, one of the stated objectives that we showed in the beginning was that. So the options are already, to a certain extent, already made. You go there to meet someone else from another discipline to interact. Since you're forced to do that and your lunch charges are deducted, so you might as well, initially when you go there, you go with this thing that I must conform. When you started the project, let's say you finish the project, now we are project neutral. Then you look around for a nice face or
comfort level to spend a few minutes. If it's a leisurely lunch versus a, I mean, there's so many factors into this.
They're all leisurely lunches.
Yeah. So then,
there's no concept of a quick.
yeah, then you're looking around to spend a little bit of time to have a leisurely lunch. So your project is one of the factors. Whether you finish, then it's your project neutral. Then your discipline. You have to go across your discipline and go to someone else because the institute told you that. It's in your subconscious. And you look around and say, no, I mustn't sit with this person. While you're walking toward that person, you slightly veer away and go to the other discipline and say, no, I might as well do my job here and have an interaction with another discipline. So the institute has already made a decision for you, towards the beginning. After you become comfortable there and you're not very conscious of this, then you change your work. So there are innumerable factors into this, your mood, your so many things.
So, but despite that initial tendency, you still find that they're grouping with people from their own discipline. And also, I mean, another response I have is that you could define discipline in different ways. I define it in a particular way, these broad categorizations. But here Wiko doesn't tell you what a discipline is. I think there's great value for biologists of different sub-disciplines of biology talking to each other. So you could break it down, to finer levels and still talk about cross-disciplinary talk. The result that I present holds only for the way I have defined disciplines in a fairly broad sort of way.
Actually, the institute here wants you to talk shop. The institute, perforce, wants you to talk shop. If I go by the stated objective of the institute, they don't want you to waste your time talking about the sky. I mean, the sky is also shop. So they want you to talk shop so that there's fruitful interaction and you sort of gain from everything. So that's already decided. There is no thing about not talking shop.
But yeah, but you're really, the institute does not get involved in any way. This is there on the website. It's not even something that is sort of told to us when we join. These are just things I picked from the website. And at no point does the institute actually try and come and enforce this. You're free.
No, but then the institute is going to charge you for that lunch, and once you're there, I'm sure one of the maybe unstated objectives is to further progress knowledge, and that comes with interaction, not with frivolous. What is the color of your shirt?
No, I don't agree. I mean, I am part of the organization that runs the institute. I don't think you can make this distinction frivolous and non-frivolous. That's the whole point. It's the frivolous discussion that will lead to something very important. So I don't think this can be so cut and dry. All one can say very broadly is that we would like people from different disciplines to talk to each other. I don't think we can say things cut and dry. Such a cut and dry. If there are no further questions, I just want to emphasize that what Hari has done today, he has raised two somewhat different conceptual issues which we can continue to think about. One is, in a situation like this, how does one define a pattern? How does one calculate a pattern? Can one even, as Rajan said, can one even say that there is a pattern? And he has used one way, but there may be many ways of calculating the pattern. What is a pattern? What is randomness? What is deviation from randomness? One way people define a pattern is deviation from randomness. But what is random will depend very much on the data. So this whole question of defining, calculating, computing, and asserting that there is a pattern. This is one issue, for which obviously there is no final answer, but that's one issue that he has raised which we can continue to discuss. The second, somewhat independent issue is, having found a pattern by whatever definition, how does one explain this pattern? And there we have seen repeatedly that there are innumerable factors that could affect this, which is true. And what is interesting is, by comparing the humans and birds, what he has shown, at least to us biologists, is that when you're talking about humans, all of us can vouch that there are innumerable factors. We can come up with many, many more factors which might be important, and realize that many, many factors are there, none of which we are taking into consideration, or most of which we are not taking into consideration. As biologists, when we study birds or wasps or whatever, we are not so good at realizing that there are innumerable factors. But there are probably more innumerable factors when you look at birds and factors. So what we must realize, what we do is we more or less assume that all the factors that we have not taken into consideration are unimportant. The factors that we are taking into consideration are the ones we are discussing, and let's hope for the best. And I think we must accept that that's what we're really doing. We are saying anything that we cannot measure is probably not important. And this is what we have measured. Let's see what sense we can make out of it. And then if somebody says, but you have not measured most of the things, then we have our favorite statement. We say, science is always a work in progress. We are not making any final statement. But I think for the scientists, we must realize that we all, of the many innumerable things, we always take into consideration only a very small fraction, which we can measure, and then we assume that the rest is not important. We don't say this, but I think we must accept that, and that is something very clear. Because of the human case, it's very easy for everybody to point out one more factor which we have not taken into consideration. The birds are not there to complain; they cannot complain. But I think that's an important point that you made. So there are really two issues which one can think about it. And thank you very much for the talk and for the discussion.